so only people won. Four people won, everybody else lost. Or 5 people. Well voted. Bailey being here today. That's what we were voting on. How likely would it be for Bailey to be here?
Really?
Not by name.
No.
But we were wondering, I was wondering if anybody would sit in that row today.
Glad I came in.
Yeah. Because you made everybody, well, at least some people winner. And some people losers. Because if you did win, you lose. Right? If you ain't first, you're last. That's Ricky Bobby likes to say. It's a movie, Holiday Nights. It's good with Will Ferrell. He's Ricky Bobby. What's that? What other dude? You don't know his name, though. I remember it was W something Riley or something. Anyways, yeah, I'll people know. Well, we're going to talk about math. The most exciting of all the sciences. Boo. You can get out now. This is underneath the door. You're in timeout. Come on now. Timeout. You're destroying my authority. Destroying my authority. It means you don't take me seriously. If you don't take me seriously, how can I be an effective teacher? We're going to start with Punnett squares, end with Punnett squares. That's really what we care about. Punnett squares are designed to tell you about genetic possibilities. And probabilities are all about trying to determine genetic possibilities. So that's sort of, again, where we're going to go with things. So we'll start out just by looking at Punnett squares, which you probably have done before, and basically know how they're set up and how they work. But we're going to talk about some math in the middle about how we do certain things, and what kind of rules apply when we have to do certain types of manipulations with the data. Turns out, if you didn't know, Punnett was a person. And as a mathematician or as a geneticist, he worked with mathematician, then decided, hey, there's probably a formula we can do to try to figure out what's going on. And now we have Punnett squares, which is nice. And all a Punnett square is a predictive device. It's a matrix. And like most mathematical matrices, you combine column A with column B to get a result. And that result will tell you both a genotype and a phenotype. It doesn't tell you numbers specifically, but you can gain an idea of numbers based off of the possibilities that can exist. Punnett squares represent an ideal state. Just because there is a 50% chance of getting X, Y, and Z doesn't mean you actually get 50% of X, Y, and Z as we go along. But it does give us a place to start with and look at probability. How often will something occur? That's all a probability is. Trying to determine how often will this occur, give an idea if it's a likely thing or an unlikely thing. And Punnett squares are basically tied to the idea of penetrance, which again is another probability of how likely your genotype is going to give you a phenotype. And basically what the Punnett square does is meiosis and the fertilization step for you. So really understanding what goes on during meiosis allows us to determine at least half of the Punnett square. I'm just going to combine it back together to get the last part of the sexual reproduction cycle. Most of the times we use the Punnett square, we're going to have to use the multiplication rule, but as we go forward, we have a more complicated type of calculation that requires both application of the multiplication rule and the addition rule at the same time, which is sometimes confusing for students to deal with. Let's just go back to the very beginning. The Punnett square is based off of Baker-Mendel's rules, segregation, and independent assortment. And so if we start with a genotype, like this, segregation says that we can separate A from A. but also B from B. The independent assortment idea says that we're going to get one A and one B, and which A and which B you get is a product of crossing over happening and independent alignment happening. But what we should hopefully appreciate is that through both crossing over and independent alignment, we should be able to get all possibilities of combinations. Now, all of them are actually going to occur, but we assume that all possibilities are possible when we look at the Punnett square. So we count for what are all the different possibilities, not what is the most likely possibility. That sometimes crossing over is more and more likely to cause differences or changes than other times. But when we look at any type of genotype, we should be able to think about how many different gamete possibilities there are. Sometimes it's pretty easy. Sometimes it's not as easy. But if we look at the example that I've given you here, here we have 3 genes for 2 different parents, but there's only a 4x4 on a square. Does anybody spot why it's not a 6x6 or an 8x8 rather than a 4x4? There's a homozygous in one parent, 2 capital A's, and there's also homozygous in the other parent, 2 lowercase b's. Remember, homozygosity decreases the chances of genetic variation. It's only when you have a heterozygosity that you have the chance of getting one thing or another thing. When you only have a chance of getting one thing, there's not a whole lot of variety that exists there. And so the general rule that we talked about for independent alignment is also going to come into play somewhat when we deal with Punnett squares. Take the number of heterozygotes or heterozygosity for the different genes, and that tells you how many sort of lines you get in your Punnett square. And this is sort of the straightforward way of looking at Punnett squares, doing one really big Punnett square. But if you've got 5 genes, your Punnett square gets really big really quickly. And if they're all heterozygote, then there's a lot of different possibilities. And maybe you make a mistake, you don't have all of the possibilities accounted for. So using mathematics, we can use Gregor-Mendel's rules also and break things apart. So instead of looking at one giant Punnett square, we look at one Punnett square for each of the genes that are present in our parents. So we calculate a very simple probability rather than a more complex probability. But with the simple probability, we can then combine them together to get a more complex probability calculation. And so we do everything independently of each other. And the one thing I also want you to keep in mind is when we look at homozygosity, it decreases the number of things that we can get. This is an idea that's important. If you do a 2x2, does it change the ratio of one thing to the other thing? Does including another line of capital A change the results? It changes the total numbers now because you have twice as many things. Because you have 2, and now if you add another capital A line, you get 4 things, but it's still the same ratio of one to the other. We again are simplifying our Punnett squares by assuming that in a homozygosity state, there is no variation, so we don't need everything to be a 2x2. Things get distilled down into a 1x2, or sometimes 2x2, sometimes even a 1x1, depending on if you have 2 homozygous situations going together. And this changes the way the probabilities are going to work. But independent assortment allows us to deal with things as being separate. And we don't care if they're on the same chromosome or on different chromosomes. Crossing over allows us to separate things that are on the same chromosome. Independent alignment allows us to separate things that are on different number of chromosomes. So we can truly treat everything as being independent of each other. A probability is just a percentage. Tells you how often will something occur. But to determine how often something will occur, you need to know what one thing you're looking for and what other possibilities also exist. And so it's kind of the same thing we've done for penetrance and allele frequency. Number of X divided by total number of something else. So just keep that in mind, and there's some simple ways to look at probabilities. This one should be pretty straightforward. Flip a coin, the chance of getting heads or tails is the same because it's either one or the other. So you got a 50-50 chance of getting heads or a 50% chance of getting tails. If you don't know anything about a deck of cards, we're going to use a deck of cards quite a bit today, which is why I said bring your money. Because the deck of cards has 52 cards, there's 4 of each type of card, and there's 13 of each suit. That allows us to do a lot of different probability calculations based off of a simple setting. But in this case, we want a king. Hopefully you know there's 4 kings, there's 52 cards, so 4 out of 52 is 1 out of 13. And that's our probability, at least. It's a fraction, converted to a number, and that's our probability. Don't try to make it more complicated than it is. Just what are we looking for, how often will that thing occur, versus how many other things are there also out there. These I've given to you, but you should be able to do some of these other ones. So let's look at this first problem here. Who is really big in D&D? That's dominance and degradation. Otherwise known as Dungeons and Dragons. Because that's what Dungeons and Dragons is about. Dominating your foes and denigrating them and degrading them by being slaughtered by orcs and dragons and necromancers. Or falling into a pit and dying. Or being turned into a toad. I don't know, dungeon masters do weird things. Apparently there's a D&D campaign on campus. It's not a campaign, I guess that's the word. So like they D&D in the library every week. Last week they sent an announcement saying, we needed a dungeon master. So our dungeon master's not here today. Please, you guys get that email? Probably not. Sent that out to like the whole university, I thought, but anyways. First probability is what? Getting a 3 on a 6-sided dice.
1 out of 6.
And what's the probability of getting a 5?
1 out of 6.
The probability of getting 2 is what? I know the probability of getting any number on a dice is just that one number, and how many sides does the dice have? I keep a record of skills. If you don't know, you aren't really paying attention to my homepage. Just right down in the bottom is a file. Skills, font size, distribution, Excel sheet. Every time I open up skills package, I count the number of each skills. I have a running total, but it's not working right now. So if you eat skills in my office, I'm gonna ask you to count them before you actually eat them. So right now I don't have the skills, but I will soon. I spotted the skill package I want. Walmart, it's a 3-pack. It's a multi-pack of 3 different types of skills. Yes, score. It's regular, berry, and hound. Anyways, does this make your mouth water for skills? Anybody?
No.
You don't like skills?
Not if there's 6 yellow.
Well, that is the chance and the risk you take by grabbing a bag of Skittles, because sometimes you're gonna get said yellow. But how often will it occur is something we can actually calculate based on the data that I have accumulated over time. But if we look at what is the probability of getting one red Skittle in this little pile of Skittles? It's a simple probability, but what is it? Okay, so first 5 is the top, because that's the number of reds. And then we divide by the total number of Skittles, which is 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6. Which is 10 plus 8 plus 18. So 5 over 18 is 5 over 18, because it doesn't reduce. Probably the beginning purple one. It's 4 out of 18, which reduces to 2 out of 9, which reduces to like 18%. Maybe it's 23%. Doesn't really matter. That's simple, right? Simple. All we do is count the number of possibilities and figure out how many things are actually going to occur. If you pick a red one and someone else has come pick a green one, does that change probabilities or do they stay the same?
Because you've taken out.
There are 2 ways to deal with probabilities. That's where we're also going to go in a second. But when you have small numbers, taking something out and removing it completely from population does change the probability of taking another sample. Especially true with a single deck of cards. Because once you get dealt one card, now the probability of all the other cards happening is changed. And if you're on a table of 5 people and everybody gets 1 card, then now you have 47 cards in the deck rather than 52. So options change. Which is why in Vegas and other casinos they have lots of deck of cards. Keep your probabilities the same, or more or less the same. So it's not exactly what we're going for, but that's sort of the thing to think about is small numbers are kind of hard to deal with because probabilities change more often. The bigger the number is, or the bigger the number of possibilities, the less likely there's for variation. Doing one probability, looking at one thing happening is easy, but looking at 2 things happening can be a little more complicated. And depending on how these 2 things interact or relate to each other, you need to use either the addition rule or the multiplication rule. And the easy thing about the addition rule is we call things mutually exclusive, meaning one thing happening prevents the other thing from happening, like flipping a coin. You can't get heads or tails, or well, it's either heads or tails. You can't get both happening at the same time. That changes the way we calculate the probabilities. If you have 2 coins that flip 2 at the same time, now your chance of getting 2 heads is a possibility, because there's 2 things that are going to occur. And flipping 1 coin is independent of flipping a second coin. Or rolling 2 dice at a time, you can get the same number twice, but that changes the probability of getting the same number just once. Now, generally speaking, when we think about the idea of the addition rule, it typically involves an or statement. I want this or this. And generally, when you apply or think about or, it increases your chance of getting what you want, because you're less selective. I don't really care what I get, but I want one of these 2 things. So now your chances of getting something you want go up. So examples like this, drawing a king or a queen from a single deck of cards is a probability that we can actually calculate. So to do that, we would need the probability of each event happening by itself first. So if you remember anything or know anything about a deck of cards, what's the probability of getting a king? 1 out of 13 or 4 out of 52. It doesn't really matter because they're both the same values. And the probability of getting a queen is the same, right? Because there's the same number of queens as there are kings. But if you're looking for this, the probability would be this, or if it was that, the probability with that, we want one or the other. And so when you look at trying to get a king or a queen, there are 8 possibilities in the deck. And we can just know that by knowing the deck and saying, yeah, there's 4 of these and 4 of these, therefore it should be 8 out of 52. But how we actually got to that 8 out of 52 is by combining together the individual probabilities. Because we take the probability of getting a king plus the probability of getting the queen, and that's how we arrive at this number. So if you know anything about cards, you kind of jump ahead and say, yeah, I know there's this many possibilities. But mathematically speaking, where we need to know how to get to the end answer, because I'm not always going to be able to pick the answer out of the hat, like we can sometimes. So on the bottom example, what's the probability of getting a 4 or a 5 if you roll a single dice, a single die?
2 out of 6 or 1 out of 3.
Right, because the probability of getting a 4 is 1 out of 6, the probability of getting a 5 is 1 out of 6. So we combine them together, 1 over 6 plus 1 over 6 is 2 over 6, which is 1 over 3. So or statements allow us to look at different probabilities. Does order matter when you look at an or statement? Because you only look at one thing happening. We don't care, because it's one thing, we don't care. It's not an order, it's not queen, then king, or vice versa, it's just one or the other. So there's no order associated with doing this type of calculation. I bring that up because we will need to deal with order in just a second. So with the addition rule, we increase our probability of getting something because we have more than one option. With the multiplication rule, we decrease our chance of getting what we want because we're looking for multiple things to happen at the same time, or requiring one thing to happen after a second thing, or a second thing after a first thing. We're looking for more than one thing, so we have a lower chance of that happening overall. And with multiplication rule, at least when you deal with problems that are going to use multiplication rule, typically you're going to involve things like I need an apple and an orange. Or I need an apple and then an orange, because I'm going to use the apple first and then the orange second. And that's the important thing. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. A lot of you probably can appreciate the difference between saying I want this and this versus I want this, then and this. And what is the difference?
And it doesn't matter what order you do it
Right. But if you specify that I want this, then this, there's an order implied there. And when order is needed, it's going to change the way we calculate the probability. Just like when order is not needed, it changes the way we calculate the probability. And the then statement is the more complicated of these two possibilities. Sorry, it's the and statement. That's the more complicated of these possibilities. Because and does not specify an order, which means there's two or more ways that something can occur. And so here we're looking at a king and then a queen, so we're going, the order is specified. I need this thing and then I need this other thing to happen second. And so to figure out the possibility, we take the individual probabilities and then multiply the two together. So we'll take 1 out of 13 times 1 out of 13. And get 1 out of 13 squared because I don't want to do the math. Like 169, I think. It doesn't really matter. We're not even talking with replacement. It is with replacement, yes. But we're not even to that point yet. We're just looking at the probability of each one individually. Yes, each one is a 1 in 13 chance just by themselves. But yes, we'll deal with the idea of with replacement, which we're going to get to in just a second, what that sort of means and how that works. Now, trying to think about how do we combine things together. If we have an or statement, then we typically combine them together by adding them. If we have an and statement, we combine them together by multiplication. So just to fill out the theme here we have 2 dice. We roll 1, we want a 4, we roll the other, we want a 5. Does order matter in this particular example? We just rolling 2 dice, we want one to be a 4 and one to be a 5. Doesn't matter which one is a 4 and which one is a 5. Not really, because if one is 5, the other has to be 4. If one is 4, the other has to be 5. So there's really no change in how they come up. But it's 1 out of 6 times 1 out of 6. Is 1 out of 36. So it's just taking the individual probability of event 1 times the individual probability of event 2 and seeing what answer you get. We assume that they're independent of each other and order does not matter. Well, most times order does matter. And that's where we're going to see some fun types of calculations occur. So this is an idea that I already talked about. The idea that when you look at the addition rule, because you're wanting or allowing other things to occur, your probability should be higher, but when you do the multiplication rule, your probability should be lower because you're looking at something that's more restrictive or putting more conditions on what you're trying to look for happen. If you want to do some more, we can do some more. I think we could beat this horse over the head sometimes. Let's start getting into a little more complicated types of things. Oh, where's my data? My data is not here. It's on the next slide. We'll get to it in a second. Yeah, we've already talked about this. A then statement does imply something different than an and statement. Then implies an order and requires no order. So for the second case, if you want a red one and a green one, does it matter which one came first? Right, it doesn't. It only matters for the first one where it says we take a red first and then a green second. That's a rule. When order does not matter, the probability of something happening increases because there's now 2 possibilities of things occurring. And what's really cool about then statements is it combines both the addition and the multiplication rule together. The one fun for the and rule. Get multiplication and addition together. A lot of times I just draw a lot of more with everything in the slides because they really just say things early a lot. So we'll finally get to a point where we've been sort of talking around it and hearing what this idea is. The idea of with replacement. With replacement, I would guess, I'm not sure if it's the best way to say it, but it kind of normalizes the numbers because the total number of individuals in the population are not going to change. So as you sample something, it doesn't change the total number of things in there. It's like catch and release. You can throw the fish back, you can catch it again, or you can catch a different fish. You never know. It doesn't really matter if you catch the same fish twice. If you're just catching to catch fish. Doesn't matter. It's like, doesn't really matter. Is it not as satisfying to catch the same fish over and over again? Maybe. I hate fishing. Sorry to say. Just sitting on a boat waiting for something to happen. I'd rather just ski than fishing. Anyway, there's a math problem that exists. And basically, when you have small numbers, there's greater variation when you get plus or minus 1. When you have bigger numbers, the variation between plus or minus 1 is much smaller. So with large number sets, the variation is very small. With small number sets, the variation is much more noticeable. So by using the with replacement, we sort of assume that the calculation is always going to be performed the same way. And with replacement only matters in the case of the multiplication rule, because we're looking at having to do two things, either simultaneously or one after the other. So if we get into how do we actually calculate this probability, we can look at the difference between one versus the other. We'll do the bottom one first. One green, then one red. Sorry, one red, then one green. Which means red has to happen first, green has to happen second. We have numbers. We have numbers. Okay. What's the probability of getting red just by itself? The numbers are on the top of the board. You can see the numbers. Red. What's red?
1 out of 18.
No.
No.
5 out of 18.
Red. Red is 5 out of 18. And green is 2 out of 18. So if we want to figure out the probability of picking one red, then one green, we just multiply it together and get like 10 out of whatever 18 squared is, which I don't remember that number off the top of my head. Sorry. Anybody know what 18 squared is? 15 squared is like 225. 20 squared is 400, so what's the average between 225 and 400? I'm not sure that's actually the average. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Is that right?
That's right.
8 times 8 is 64. Okay, I'll apply that. 10 over 324. Is this a high probability or a low probability? I don't know. I guess it goes somewhere in the middle. Which two would give you the greatest chance of getting what you want? Yeah, because they're the ones that are most numerous. I'm never asking you to do that, but if you think about it, if you want something, want the thing that there's most of, your chance of getting it are pretty high. There's very few things you want. The chance of getting that one thing are pretty small. So let's look at the second one, the and. With and, we have order. So how many ways can this event happen? One red and one green. Yes, and has no order. Sorry, and has no order. But there are orders we have to consider. and world, there are multiple ways in which things happen. So there are two different possibilities for the order of the events to happen, because we don't care about the order. In the first case within, we care red is first, green is second. But in the world of and, green could be first, red could be second. We still get exactly what we want. The question is, does that change your probability of getting what you want if you don't care about the order? Actually, it does.
Makes your probability go up.
It does. Because you have a greater chance of getting what you want if you don't care about the order. Because there's two options. This is one option, but you also have the other option as well. This is red, then green. This is green, then red. Both give you one red, one green. So because there are two ways for that event to happen, our chances of getting what we want go up. So we use the multiplication rule to calculate an individual probability, and then use the addition rule to combine those back together. So now our probability gets to be 20 out of 324. So we're going to combine those together. Just add them. Top gets added, the bottom stays the same mathematically. Who's done fractions since 4th grade? You can use a calculator, it's really alright. That's what we need to think about, and keep in mind, when we see the statement and, there are most likely multiple ways for that thing to occur. When you see the word then, there's only one way for that thing to occur. And when there's only one way for something to occur, it's going to have a lower probability than if there's multiple ways for something to occur. Now what we're really going to try to do is use some genetic data. So let's use some genetic problems. Instead of calculating the allele frequency, let's calculate the genotypic frequency. So what is the probability that if we sample two individuals from this population, that will get one that's homozygous dominant and one that is homozygous recessive? What's the math that we need to do this calculation? Now, it might be easier to start with the bottom problem, because that's a then statement, which implies that there is only one way for this thing to occur. We're also doing with a placement, so the total number of individuals in the population never changes, the probabilities sort of stay constant. So what's the probability that we can pick one individual that's homozygous dominant from this data set here? It's 50 out of 100. So our dominant is 50 out of 100. We'll just leave it like that for keeping the denominator the same. And homozygous recessive, what is our chance of getting a homozygous recessive individual? 15 out of 100. So if you want the dominant one first and then the recessive one second, so we multiply these two things together and get whatever it is. 50 times 15. $300? What? What'd you say? 450?
750.
750. Over 10 to the 4th. Which is 10,000. 750 out of 10,000. So again, all we did was we multiplied these two things together to deal with this first probability of a then statement. For the and statement, there are two ways in which the event can happen. Dominant can be first, recessive can be second, or recessive first, dominant second. Because there are two possibilities of it to occur, the order is very easy to think about. We just have to multiply the individual probability by 2. We can add it together, which is the same thing as multiplying by 2, because there's two chances, or two ways for this thing to occur. Now sometimes people look at this and they, yeah, that makes sense. this is the probability of these two combined together, because there's two ways it can occur, that makes sense, multiply by two. Other people don't understand this, have to go the long way, which is to actually add them together. But if you multiply by two, are you actually doing the right thing? If you multiply by two, do you multiply by the top or the bottom, or just the top and the bottom? Some people have weird mathematics issues. But yeah, when you multiply by two, you only multiply by the top. So that's the same thing as adding 750 to 750 instead of 50 times 2. So math works out fine. Again, one of us was mentioning earlier is this is really no different than what we did when we calculated penetrance. It's a probability. The probability of penetrance was the number of individuals divided by the number of individuals. But because there's only one thing, we don't have to use the addition rule or the multiplication rule. So you can have a simple probability by itself. But we're sort of transitioning from simple probabilities like penetrance to more complex probabilities. We're trying to combine two different probabilities together in some way.
Is that how you want our answer, like per 1,000?
No, you actually have a decimal point number. And a lot of these are going to be really small numbers because the events we're going to talk about are fairly rare. And so usually it's like 10 to the minus 4. Sometimes 10 to the minus 6. So these events aren't very common to occur because looking for a lot of things to happen. Anytime you have lots of things happening, the probability goes down quite a bit. OCD there for a second. What we are really trying to go to is to use our genetic data and to use Punnett squares to calculate something fun like the probability of getting 3 of a child with blue eyes and red hair and 4 of a child with green hair and blue eyes. There's a lot of different things going on there. So that's why we're starting building up slowly to do a more complicated type of problem. And so looking at Punnett squares, we can figure out the probability of any genotype existing based off of the parentage. So we have these are the exact same parents and exact same Punnett squares that were in our slides earlier. But it's now just broken down, we can see the probability of each of the different genotypes. The further complication of our calculation is going to be adding in phenotypes. But before we get to phenotypes, we'll just look at some basic calculations and see if we're all sort of on the same page. I probably this should have been animated, the answers are given away. In this case, it says calculate the probability of getting a child that is heterozygous for all 3 genes. So they have to take the individual probabilities of being heterozygous for A, heterozygous for B, and heterozygous for E, multiply those all together because it's the addition rule. And there's no order. We're looking for this to happen, we're all happening at the exact same time. So there's no way for order to exist. You're looking for somebody with 3 different traits. You can't have one trait and then get a second trait and then get a third trait because they're born at once with all the traits all at once. But this is a simplistic idea. Hopefully we can all say, yeah, that makes sense. Next question is, does it make sense? We'll find out as we go forward, does it actually make sense? But if we do something more fun, which is throw in phenotype, now we have to worry about is something completely dominant or incompletely dominant. Because if you remember, ratios change when we have complete dominance versus incomplete dominance. Because with incomplete dominance, the heterozygous state is a completely different phenotype than the homozygous dominant and the homozygous recessive. But for complete dominance, the heterozygous is the same as the homozygous dominant. So you have to keep that in mind, and a lot of people will forget this idea as they're starting to do the calculations. They assume everything is completely dominant, even though it says incomplete dominance, or it tells you there's 3 phenotypes for a trait. Sometimes it won't say complete dominance and incomplete dominance. It'll just say that there's 2 phenotypes for this trait. You need to assume that means complete dominance. And it says there's 3 traits or 3 phenotypes for a trait. You should assume that means we're in a case of incomplete dominance. So starting out, we have our parents. I don't know if you know the context of this genetic problem.
Classic.
Yes, and the question is, can we build a mathematical model that actually correctly accounts for donkey and dragon's offspring? Because they're very weird. And what is dominant is hard to decide sometimes. So I just had to take a guess sometimes. And this is actually wrong. If you think about it, didn't all of donkey's children fly? So that might imply that flight should be dominant. But who cares? Say we have some of the genotypes. And what we want to do is we break these up using the law of independent assortment. We break them up and break each one up using the law of segregation, so we get 4 Punnett squares that give us this type of data for phenotypes. These 3 were the 3 that had complete dominance, which is why there's only 2 traits for each. This is a case that you'll actually experience at some point or another, because I don't prejudge what the answer should be. I just mix and match things together and make you calculate it. Sometimes an answer could be 0, because the probability the thing can't actually occur based on the genotypes of our parents. So that's something that you should hopefully keep in mind, that sometimes the thing is not possible, or sometimes it's the only possibility. Like this here, it's a 100% chance that this is going to occur because of the genotypes of our parents. So if we try to do some calculations, we just have to combine them together by using the simple multiplication rule. You have to trust me that these are the same ones, but anything we're looking for combining these together using multiplication rule. There's no and or then, it just says you have, if you breathe fire, have gray hair. You could say and gray hair or fur. Even though you use the word and doesn't mean there's 2 orders that occur, because you need to have both traits to exist. Again, if we keep doing this, we have cases where sometimes the answer is 0. These are the types of problems that you will see on your quiz this weekend. It will start with a series of simple probability calculations, like using Skittles, counting out how many are each and how many total, and working with that. Sometimes you may be asked to combine those Skittles numbers together and do a multiplication rule or addition rule type of problem. Your quiz this weekend will not deal with Punnett squares just yet. That'll be something for later. We'll save that until they actually get to the very end of dealing with these things. But again, where we are building to is to be able to calculate a problem where we have 2 parents, and those parents are going to have a number of children, and some of those children will have X and Y traits, and others of them have A and B traits. And we can do that calculation all pretty easy, but it does require a combination of multiplication rule and addition rule into a single mathematical formula. But you should be able to do all the calculations on your quiz weekend using just a simple case of multiplication rule or a simple case of addition rule. And look for the key words: then versus or. I don't believe there'll be any and statements on the quiz this weekend, but I could make a mistake. I'm not trying to trick you. I just want to make sure we're all on the same footing for as we go forward. Can we just deal with doing some simple probability calculations? And even though it might not say it, we always use with replacement. the total number of samples or individuals does not change as we pull one out or take one away. Assume that you put it back once you sample it, and therefore the probabilities stay the same. It'd be like drawing a card and then putting it back, shuffling the deck, and drawing another card and seeing what happens, because then the probability doesn't change each time. Does anybody have any general questions right now about just doing some simple probability calculations? I'll leave a few more additional problems on the lecture review if you want to work some practice problems. But we'll pick this up right here on Monday. Big Monday. Big